Hello, Propenomix people, and welcome to Property and Poppadoms as well. This is obviously a special edition, basically driven by the Chancellor's spring statement released yesterday. So just a little wash up in case our memories aren't what they were. Let's be fair on everybody. We've had a rocky few years because of the pandemic. Every economy in the world has had issues that have come off the back of them. We still have to seem in the UK to have some more legacy issues, more so than a lot of the other Western world economies, which seems strange and probably needs answering and addressing. But one of the things that we sort of slipped into was having a budget every 6 months. And it's not helpful. To give Rachel Reeves her due, it seems much more likely and sensible for us to have a budget every 12 months. Business would be happy with that. And in fact, as much forward guidance, if I borrow a phrase from Mark Carney when he was the Bank of England governor, forward guidance is a good thing. It means businesses can plan. Now, businesses got kicked in the face in the October budget, you'll remember, primarily because the cost of employing people went up. Employers' national insurance up massively. There's a few pro-Labour people I see posting online who are delighted that inflation went down from 3 to 2.8 the other day. It's a little bit early to call that much of a victory because apart from anything else, April's numbers are going to look pretty horrible, folks. Why? Well, we've got a big increase in energy. It was baked in at about 1% until a few weeks before the cap was set in February. It's ended up nearly 7%. So we've got 7% to consider there. And then we've also got massive council tax rises apart from anything else, 5, 10, 15. I think the record somewhere is about 35% council tax increase because we've got councils increasingly under massive pressure, primarily because of things like temporary accommodation budgets, actually, as it goes. And that's obviously very relevant to the property audience. So that's where we were and are. And Rachel Reeves, in her infinite wisdom, has decided that what we'll do is we'll have this every 12 months. But then she's ended up with some very strict fiscal rules in place. And she has flexed them a little bit to allow for investment, which makes tons of sense when you think about it. Because if you're borrowing to make money, well, that's what most of us, if not hopefully all of us, do in property, unless we've already got loads of money and we just use cash, of course. We're borrowing to invest. So it makes sense at the governmental level to do that, if you can be sensible with it. Obviously, things like HS2 call into question their ability to run big projects and things like that. We know that. There's no point dwelling on that. I don't think I fancy being a project manager for HS2 either, to be honest with you. I'm sure it'd go pretty badly if I was. But a lot of it is gamesmanship. Everybody knows it's going to cost more money. It's going to take more time and all the rest of it than initially said. And then we have huge amounts of inflation, which don't make things look any better. And I'm just going to hang on that point for a moment, because one of the things it's really difficult to get ahead around, and Rachel Reeves made a couple of mistakes yesterday, primarily because she says things that she understands, that people in the Treasury understand. I don't believe the majority of Parliament would actually understand them, to be honest with you, because they're not economists and they're not always even particularly financially literate MPs. There's no literacy test to become an MP. You need to be a good talker. Apart from anything else, that's primarily what you need to be able to do. But certainly you're going to get, even if the economics media, even if the people commenting on it do understand, they're deliberately going to misinterpret things. And this is primarily around when you factor in inflation and when you don't. Because when you think about growth, we talk about growth. Labour have talked about growth. That's been their one word repeated 3 times, growth, 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 right? We have to remember that is adjusted for inflation, those figures. So we had some pretty massive increases in nominal GDP growth. That's when it's not been adjusted for inflation. And then it was adjusted down to, it's been very flat. And, you know, the last, certainly since first part of 2023, or since Liz Truss, realistically, GDP per head in real terms has gone backwards, GDP per person. Now, growth, GDP growth has not. Otherwise, we would have had continual recession, really, right? But GDP per head has, but not in nominal terms. There's still more money out there, and you can see this evidenced by, and you know, on the street. What does this mean? Well, it's people saying, "I've got a minimum wage increase, but I don't feel like I've got any more money. Everything else is going up." Of course, part of the problem is things are going up in order to pay for minimum wage increases in businesses. But this is the tragedy of the employers' national insurance. there are some figures knocking around saying 75% of that is going to play itself out in lower wages for people. So the no tax on working people is just not true. And of course, you could easily torpedo that with council tax rises at 4.99% is the legislated limit without having to get governmental approval. I think they've approved in 23 or 26 councils around the country to go above that amount. But then, of course, they are going through. Their defence would be, and it's got, there's an element there. Their defence would be, well, hang on a second, we're going through this devolution process within England, and that's going to save money at councils and all the rest of it. And I'm sure potentially it will in the medium term. It's not going to save any money in the short term because it's going to cost money to do all this restructuring. No doubt there'll be new offices. No doubt there'll be different recruitment. No doubt there'll be levels of layoffs. All of these things are going to cost money. But of course, the irony is, and this is the way the SNP are going to paint it, what we're saying is because the employer's national insurance has gone up, we're having to cut disability benefits in order to fund the increase in national insurance for the people who work for the councils, for the state. That's a very convoluted way of looking at it, which obviously is to do with their agenda. You can say that X equals Y, and it's because of Z if you want to. Correlation is not causation. It would be really, really easy to pretend this was the case. But that's not really the way that the accounting side of things works. But it is true that a 25 billion increase in employers' national insurance, 5 billion of that was to be paid by the public sector itself. So it was only a net 20 billion. It is true to say 4 billion more would come off corporation tax, because if your costs go up by 20 billion, all other things being equal, your corporation tax bill comes down. And it is true to say if the economy had carried on growing at the rate it was, rather than the rate that it reverted to after the budget surprise, and just since Labour have been elected, because we were growing at about nearly 2% a year, the economy, or even a bit faster, and then we went to a place where we were growing at 0% a year. So I've only allowed for 1% GDP growth cost since the election. It could arguably be a bit higher, but that costs us about £9 billion in tax revenue as well. So if we were going to get 16 net, we've lost 9. We've got 7 billion net from this increase, which is really also is just a tax on jobs. It costs more to employ people. What are people doing about that? Well, in the real world, they are deciding that what they need to do is employ fewer staff, offshore some more stuff. And it's not just this shock. It is a shock when employers' national insurance goes up and it wasn't expected. It's not just the shock side of that, right? It's the businesses not believing that this won't happen again and again and again. So you do plan for the future, especially in smaller businesses where you're very invested in them. You've not got shareholders to appease necessarily. Yes, of course you need to survive, but you're thinking about the next 3, 5, 10 years. Unless you've got sale or retirement on the horizon, that's what you're going to be thinking about. So if you think, right, actually what I need to do here is outsource offshore a lot more. I did an exercise yesterday. I reckon it depends on the industry, but if you factor in holidays, sickness, and this is under the current rules, not under the workers' rights bill, whatever ends up happening within all of that, right? But sickness, holidays, productivity in general, this is without factoring productivity, actually, it still costs about £16.50 an hour to employ someone on the minimum wage with these new national insurance thresholds, unless you're a teeny tiny business and the employer's the allowance kicks in, which absolves you of the first, I think it's £10,300 of national insurance from the 1st of April. But unless you're benefiting from that, cost of people has gone up, and you're thinking, well, it's just going to go up and up and up again and again and again. In September, when various bits were set, like pensions, for example, inflation was 1.7, and the Low Wage Commission recommended 6.7 for minimum wage, so 5 full percentage points ahead of inflation at that point. If that keeps going on, the only way out is to make people redundant. We are having to look around at the businesses that we run, and we are seeing that a redundancy consult is a very strong probability, or will absolutely need to be done. And it's easier to contract things out than to deal with staff who don't necessarily want to turn up on time or turn up at all, because the cost of that is really significant. Whereas if you use an agency, if you use a contractor, it's much more likely that those things will work. And those businesses run to pretty thin margins because they know that £16.50 an hour, right? If, like some companies who accept staff are only productive 80% of the time, then that £16 something an hour goes up to £20 something an hour of productive work, right? It's an unbelievable cost when you think about it, because you can still outsource to the Philippines at $3 an hour or even cheaper. So you don't have to go to the Philippines. You can go to places in the same time zone. You can go to places where it's much more likely to be native English speakers, all sorts of that sort of stuff. Nothing wrong with the Philippines. There's some fantastically hard workers that have assisted a few of our businesses over the years and still do. So don't get me wrong. So we'll move on to the statement. I'll just say a couple of other things. There was a bit of there's a chap who, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, who you might have seen get some airtime the last couple of days. He's got himself in trouble for comparing benefits to pocket money, he said, which is a bit unfair on him, to be honest with you. And I'll come out publicly and state it. I quite like Darren Jones because he is exactly what the Treasury needs. He is a brutal economist. He looks at these things and said, you move this, you change this. So their point around cutting disability benefits, for example, is not putting people on the scrap heap. Well, there's a bit of political gamesmanship in that, of course there is, but there is certainly the left-leaning side of the Labour Party that think we should go full magic money tree and just dish the cash out left, right and centre. But benefits have been growing at such a massive, massive rate that ultimately we're going to get ourselves in big, big trouble, and we're going to end up with either devaluing, we're going to end up defaulting on bonds, we're going to end up in a really tough situation. Not now, not tomorrow, not in 2026, right? But within probably a 20-year time horizon, this stuff really strongly needs to be addressed. And Labour are going a little bit of the way towards addressing that. For me, you just look at the international evidence, right? And the international evidence shows that we've had a much higher rate of sickness since COVID that hasn't come back. And the way to look at that, I think, is that ultimately the only way to get a possibly livable amount out of the benefit system is to make sure you're on personal independence payment or a similar amount. The assessments got pretty slack. They're also very, very broad these days. There's huge amounts of money going out to people with autism and ADHD. I'm not going to comment on whether people with autism and ADHD need those payments, but I am going to comment on the fact that there seems to be a huge prevalence of that in the UK versus in other Western developed nations. And I'm pretty sure some of these tweaks will see what the Labour Party are looking for. Now, we've got other issues as well. 1 in 8 under 25s not in employment, education or training. Massive, massive issue and needs sorting out for the future of the economy, right? So that's the backdrop for all of this spring statement that came out. Now, what did Rachel Reeves promise? She promised no tax, no spend. So that, in theory, qualifies it as not a budget and therefore just a statement. Although no spend is a little bit naughty, because really if there's cuts, then that is about spending, isn't it? And that is about fiscal policy. Why did that absolutely have to be done? And this is the argument against waiting 1 year. Well, what's changed since October? Okay, we had, we didn't have the result of the US election before then. Donald Trump was a reasonable odds-on favourite. He was given about a 66% chance of winning by the markets, but that's not a penalty kick. And also, what it looked like very early days is that geopolitically he might be able to resolve a couple of situations and therefore would take risks downwards. But he's really furthered his NATO aren't spending their 2% on defence agenda really significantly, in spite of the fact that America is the only NATO country to have ever triggered Article 5 of the treaty, which requires everybody to get involved in their defence after 9/11. The deep irony of that is not lost on anyone, I'm sure. But ultimately, his position is pretty clear. America first at the expense of whoever else. Now, is it going to backfire? That's a different kettle of fish, because what you might see is real anti-sentiment against buying defence equipment, for example, which now that spend needs to go up massively. Maybe won't be bought from American companies. It would be a much, much better idea, in my opinion, if the UK followed much more of what's called the Preston model, named after the local authority, who decided that what they would do is, with the massive amount of spending that they can do in a year, they would prioritise local companies and local businesses and local people. And what does that mean? It keeps more money in the area. A very, very good idea versus let's just go to the cheapest. If you do that these days, you buy all your stuff from Timo and Shein, and you're not worried about the fact that people working there are pretty much slaves and all the rest of it. And you're not worried about the fact that it's cheap, but it only lasts 3 minutes, or it isn't very good in the first place. So that also needs considering, of course. So if we just go to the cheapest, we know that we're always going to struggle. So that was the backdrop pretty much to the statement, and why Rachel Reeves, it's only a statement, not a budget. What else have we seen change since October? Well, we've seen NHS England be announced that it's going to be dissolved. Hasn't really made too much in terms of headlines given the size of the organisation. So quite a big deal, I thought, really. But obviously there's tacit support for that, I think, from what I'm hearing in the NHS in general. And that there are lots of things that aren't going well with too many decision makers and all the rest of it. Exactly the sort of thing that we would expect, right? Now, what is Labour's argument? And this is, let me just say a little bit first about the UK has got on offer the most stable government, I think, in the developed Western world, right? The election's far enough away, and you've got, although we've got our own far right party that have been making getting traction in the polls, we've still got the first past the post system. We don't use proportional representation. You know, there was a significant election in Germany where Alternative for Deutschland gained about 26% of the vote, I think it was, and ultimately they were frozen out of forming any kind of government because everybody else rounded against them. But the more and more you see more and more of that side of the vote is gaining, right? There's a massive push away from democracy in the USA at the moment. Do not miss that point, folks, right? Democracy isn't cool anymore. People are looking more towards autocratic solutions. Almost inevitable, really, after a pandemic, as a little aside as well. Almost inevitable. But that's where the world is. But we were a long, long way away from a reform government or a reform coalition as yet being formed in the UK, I think, anyway. So stability. Investment doesn't care about this stuff, right? Investment doesn't care about politics. It cares about stability. It cares about the rule of law. Why is UK property so popular? Because ultimately it has the land register, right? You go and buy, you can go be in Dubai, be in a lot of other countries in the world. Do you actually own the property if you buy a property there? No, you don't. You don't own the land underneath it. It's a lease, and you're reliant on the regime at the time. And you see some of these regimes, like, for example, Saudi Arabia, where they've got someone in charge at the moment who wants to try and build this mega city, 14 trillion, I think it's going to cost, this whole NEOM thing. And it looks undeliverable, impossible. And I'm not sure how worthwhile it will be when it's actually done. And it could bankrupt them. I'm sure it won't, but they're more likely to just stop work, slow down works, run out of money, etc., etc. In an economy, we're in incredible shape, right? So that's where we are. So that's sort of the complete backdrop to the statement. What were the big things that Rachel Reeves wanted to make a big deal of? This stability, which might, by default, I think, make the UK one of the best places to invest. Now, is that because of fantastic government work from the Labour Party or from the Conservatives before them? I think, I'm going to say there, absolutely not. Right? It's definitely not to do with that. But we win by being the least worst, which is crackers, isn't it, really? But it does make sense. So Europe's going to need to stick together. America's going to have some pretty bad feeling, I think, is going to be created by all of this. And if that manifests in, right, we're going to spend some of this money in people like BAE Systems, or other companies like that. Of course, we need to be cautious. 77% of the FTSE, I believe, is denominated in dollars, or businesses that are denominated in dollars. That's the FTSE 100. But of course, that's not our entire economy, but it is the largest companies that are listed on our stock exchange. So we do need to be aware of all of that, right? So stability is a big deal. This isn't much. This is just being sort of positioned as not much of a big deal. It's only a statement. There's no tax, no spend. What were the bits that Rachel wanted to really beat the drum about? Full commitment to get defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. Now, we don't spend a lot on defence, really. 2.2 billion additional funding for the MOD next year. With the numbers that get thrown around these days, it's really not a big deal, is it? We spend way more on servicing our debt than we spend on defence. But there's a bit of smoke and mirrors going on here because Keir Starmer has already said, look, we're going to get to 3%. Now, their biggest problem is percentages. It's one pie, right? So however you do the numbers, that one pie can only be sliced so many times. And if it's going to be 3% somewhere from 2.2, something has to be cut by 0.8. Now, they've already talked about and are cutting the international aid budget, which is probably a fairly populist sort of move. But that's only by about 0.3%. I think it's going down to about 0.2% of GDP. So you can't keep cutting that. So you're going to need to cut health benefits somewhere else for defence. Now, interestingly, the fiscal rules which Rachel Reeves relaxed back in October to allow for more investment and spending, Germany's approach to this whole situation is, right, we're going to change our fiscal rules for defence. And you could argue, well, do you know what? Defence will boost GDP. Again, the more we spend at home, the better, right? In terms of jobs, in terms of tax receipts and all the rest of it. If we keep away from the fact that the morals of making weapons or not, because economics doesn't really have room for that argument, regardless of how you feel about it, really, to be honest, then the money's still got to come from somewhere. But we could have adjusted our fiscal rules again and said, look, we don't need to keep to the rules for defence spending, because this is going to mean it's going to create these jobs, it's going to do this, and it's going to create this growth, and therefore we can borrow for defence spending. And the reason why we can do that is because the world has changed significantly since October, because it has changed. But of course, we, along with a lot of the other countries in the world, are currently going around kind of like this with Donald Trump, not wanting to say anything to offend him, because he can be seen as a relatively vengeful gentleman who might do whatever if he has a bad day or feels like picking on you. And at the moment, he's picking on our digital services tax, even though the idea is to get the people who don't pay tax, because they come up with these smoke and mirrors domiciles in Bermuda or whatever for their intellectual property, to actually pay something that looks like relatively their fair share, or not Amazon to be able to come in, plunder our high streets and destroy them completely, and then suck all the money out of the UK whilst only employing some drivers and some people in warehouses that ultimately soon they'd probably quite like to make redundant anyway, with drones, robots, and whatever else Elon and the rest of them are all making at this time. We need to try and capture that value of stuff that's going on in the UK. How that's going, how that's going to pan out, we'll see, obviously. Now, then a big amount has been made about reforming the state. And as I said earlier, this is about, from the Labour Party perspective, the positioning is not writing people off as sick for all this time. How do we retrain? How do we do this? How do we do that? The undercurrent, though, is if there's less money, if you're on benefits, then more people will go into the workforce. And we know that's the case. We saw that in 2010, after 2010, and the brutality of the Conservative austerity. What it did is it forced the unemployment rate down from about 9% to about 3.5% at its low. And that wasn't all about austerity. The economy recovered, the economy grew. That's what the economy does. Just a little segue on that point as well, because we've had now, I don't make a big deal of the inflation figures at the moment. It went down to 2.8 instead of 2.9. I don't think there's any reason to pop any champagne corks. And like I said, when we get April's figure in May, it's going to look horrific. The Bank of England thinks September's figure is going to be the worst one this year, about 3.75%. I can't find too much fault in that number as a dart, although I wouldn't be surprised if April's number was worse myself. But, you know, they've got lots more forecasters and PhDs and all the rest of it. I have 0 PhDs and just me in my spare room here at the moment. So bear that in mind, please. But I don't think there's a big deal to be made about that. But the PMIs, which I do really like, the Purchasing Managers Indices for March, there was a real sudden surprise tick up to the upside, back to what looked like really healthy growth numbers. What looked like the first quarter and the second quarter of 2024, actually, before the election was announced. It was straight back to that level. And that was a big surprise to me and to everyone. It looks like all of the employers' national insurance stuff has been baked into the numbers, and that's what we're going to see. Now, how's that going to play itself out on the street? I think you're still going to see, without a shadow of a doubt, businesses that rely on people on minimum wage really struggling and closing. So retail, pubs, hospitality, restaurants, stuff like that, they are still going to visibly struggle because they've been hit 3 times. Min wage, employers' national insurance contributions, massive increase in business rates if their business rates pay us. Right, massive 67% increases in business rates for people. So if the Labour Party don't think that's going to hurt a lot of SMEs and stuff. So visually, I think you'll see pain on the street, but that's not representative of the UK economy. 80% of it is services, and things like accommodation are counted within those services, right? Don't get me wrong. But 80% is services, and an awful lot is office-based, knowledge-based, consultancy, accountancy, professional services, and it looks like those are doing fine. Otherwise, that PMI report wouldn't have come in the way it did. So that was a real surprise uptick. It wouldn't have changed anything in the statement because that was only, again, that was Monday of this week. So this has all been prepared for a lot longer than that. But it wasn't bad news. But it did feed into what was a really pleasant surprise for me, which was the Office for Budget Responsibility. Now, I was listening to Rachel Reeves on the radio this morning and the preamble to all of that. And I find it a little bit annoying sometimes, to be honest, well, most of the time, to be honest, because people are positioning the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is a quango, right? They're non-elected, yeah, and their forecasts haven't been great over the past few years. I've been one of the first ones to say that, yeah, but they say they have too much power. Now, power is incorrect. They don't have any power whatsoever. The Chancellor and the Treasury are all seeing, all coming, almighty. If you read any books about the internal workings of Whitehall, of Downing Street, and all the rest of it, the Treasury runs everything, right, with an absolutely iron fist, regardless of who is in power. So the OBR don't have any power, but they do have massive influence in what they say. And the pleasant surprise for me was the growth forecast had to be cut. They put this ridiculous 2% forecast out that was never going to happen for this year. That's down to 1% now, according to them. The Bank of England are at 0.75. I adjusted mine before the start of the year to between 0.5% and 1%, so 0.75 if you like. So Bank of England are now in line with me. OBR at the top of my range. I don't see any reason to change that. I think we could, with this PMI reading, if it's not a one-off and a fluke, we could achieve that 1% growth this year actually now as we go, which would be great. And maybe we can achieve 1.1, 1.2. 1.3 if we had a real following wind. Nothing ever goes smoothly, and we've got these tariffs to consider and all the rest of it. So I'm sticking at 0.5 to 1. I think that'll be loosely right. And that sounds bad, right? Because less growth, less tax. So when we grow, we normally pick up about 38% of the GDP growth in tax revenue. That's the current tax burden, roughly, that we're operating under. And that's why I said earlier on, Rachel Reeves cost us 9 billion after the last budget between then and now because she flatlined growth completely. But if we are going to grow, that's being taken into account in all the OBR forecasts. And the pleasant surprise was, although they went 2% to 1% this year, they adjusted their 4 other years, the next 4 years, upwards more than by 1% in total. So actually, the economy is bigger than it was in the October forecast. So that is a massive result for Rachel Reeves. Do I believe that? I don't know. Their growth figures are pretty bullish, to be honest with you. But that's what this is, the power versus influence, right? They've got massive influence. That's what they've said. We have to take them at face value. We believe them because the international bond markets believe them, right? Largely speaking. And that's very important to stability of debt and all the rest of it, of this country. And then there's a 13 billion announcement of more capital infrastructure over the next 5 years. Construction workers being trained up 60,000. Now, I've already seen, if you don't follow him already, there's a great guy on LinkedIn, Noble Francis, always comes out with the facts and the figures in the construction industry, follows things like the brick index, how many bricks are being made and bought in the UK. Fantastic real-time information. Now, he pointed out that with 400,000 workers down on the great financial crisis sort of era, so 60,000 is a good start, but we're still 340,000 short. Now, we probably need to make something out of the fact that perhaps workers can be more productive. There's perhaps more 3D printing and or modular construction, although you have to temper that by saying all you hear about is modular construction companies going broke. So I don't know if we are getting more out of a house. We certainly need more consultants than we used to. Listen, and if you haven't listened to it yet, Rod's done a brilliant podcast with Michael Keaveney, who's the director of Granger. And one of the things that Rod says on there is in the last 3 years, he's got double the number of consultants on a scheme that he used to have. And Michael informed that Granger have got 100 consultants on one scheme that they're doing at the moment. So imagine there's a lot of talk about cutting some of this bureaucracy and all the rest of it. There's been big promises about that. You know, a Labour government that are deregulating doesn't really feel right to a lot of people, but it's the right thing to do. So we've just got to still see evidence of it. How long is it going to take? When are we going to? I was hoping we might hear a bit about it in the statement, but didn't see anything that came out anyway. So what's interesting is that the OBR have said, yes, do you know what? We do believe more homes will be built. Again, going back to Rod's podcast, Michael Keaveney says he uses the word radical about these reforms, and he's delighted to hear them for the Labour Party. for the country, apart from that. And he would be, of course, he's the Director of Land and Development at Granger. So he's going to want pro-development policies. We know that. But he's genuinely really excited about what's going on that side of things. And he really does feel for him to use the word radical, because listed company directors tend to choose their words pretty carefully because of the influence that they have, is really good news. The OBR have seen that as meaning 170,000 more homes to be built over the forecast period. This forecast period is the next 5 years, so it takes us into 2029, 2030, by which point, of course, we will have had to, by law, have had an election by then as well. But those extra homes add 6.8 billion to the economy, right? Real GDP up by 0.2. It's not small money, right? And real GDP up by more than 0.4 in 10 years' time. So it has a really positive effect and impact. And that's brilliant, right? The biggest positive real GDP effect the OBR has ever reflected in a forecast for a policy with no cost. And I think that's cleverly put aside. Or they do say no fiscal cost, because obviously you could argue cost to the environment, cost to this, cost to that, but no fiscal cost. So really, really clever. If you can find money without fiscal spend, that's exactly what the UK or any other economy needs at the moment, right? It also means a bit of reduction of borrowing, which really, really helps on all fronts. And that's something that's helped to improve things over the forecast period without a doubt. They're still referring to the defence spending ambition to increase to 3% in the next Parliament. I suspect if you're thinking quite sensibly, you're thinking, look, is America in a new world, and will the Republicans win again next time, and will it be J.D. Vance, I guess, would be the obvious candidate at this time, without picking, Tucker Carlson or Elon, or it can't be Elon because unless they change the constitution, of course, which you never know, let's face it. But it does take a 2/3 majority in the Senate to change the constitution. So it's unlikely to happen, I think, for various reasons. But it's the ambition to get defence spending to 3%. I guess they might be thinking, well, when Trump's out of the way, perhaps you'll get whoever you will get from the Democrats. I don't know if you will at the moment, because they look like they're in a complete and utter mess. They look a little bit like the Conservative Party of 1997 or the Labour Party of 2010 or 2015, arguably. Complete and utter unelectable mess at this time, but they've got some time to regroup. So let's see what happens. But they might be thinking that all gets reversed. America come back into whatever organisations they will have wrecked or left by then, whether that's the World Bank, World Health Organization, NATO, goodness knows what else. I don't think Europe will just not, lock their doors and say we'll never do business with the US again. It would just be a bit silly, wouldn't it, really? So into the language then that gets used here, we've got further and faster on reform. That's the big shout. It's still mentioning the 22 billion black hole, which everyone's got fed up of listening to. NHS waiting lists have fallen for 5 months in a row. A little bit naughty, that one, realistically, because they were already falling before Labour got elected, but then they got so bad. This is like getting really fat before you go on a diet. It's a false result anyway, but at least they are falling. That's all. They can only work with what's in front of them, realistically, I guess you would say. Breakfast clubs in primary schools are being given a lot of boosters, liberating parents to be able to go to work who can't work. And they're saying that that's going to be the provision. And again, if you look across the developed world, Western Europe, etc., you would see better childcare provisions at cheaper costs. So that is the right direction to be driving in. The welfare cuts that have already been put out, 4.8 billion is supposedly the cost saving by the time we get to 2029, 2030. The welfare bill is utterly gigantic, over 100 billion. Primarily pensions, which no one wants to take on, which I find cowardly, to be honest with you. I think there needs to be a fair way to take pensions on, to say we need to kick out the age at which you're going to get your state pension. Otherwise, there isn't going to be a state pension for the generation afterwards. And that honest conversation needs to be had. But this is just example number 64 of why I would never get elected, because I would insist on telling people the economic truth, and nobody wants that. If you look at the rise of reform, one of the things they absolutely have not done is tell the economic truth. Indeed, their last efforts around the last election were about 70 billion off in their calculations, and they come up with these frankly made up places to get money from that just would not work or have a terrible impact on the economy. So they also keep using these phrases like going further and faster to grow the economy. It's a bit difficult to swallow when we've had 6+ months of very, very flat economic growth. Even if the March figures are great and they look good, we do look good for an economic a rise in growth in March. That'll be therefore in Q1. We won't get those figures till May. So we've got a good 7 or 8 weeks yet of waiting to see that happen, although that does look like what should happen. And then we also need to see what happens in April if there's a big swathe of redundancies, things like that that are going on. We will see. The way that the Bank of England, interestingly, sort of bake that into their forecasts is a 2-year period over which this employer's national insurance change gets absorbed into the economy. We'll see. I would have expected it to be a bit quicker than that myself. Certainly for it to be more front-loaded than that. There's also an announcement of another 2 billion for social and affordable housing. Look, it's a good effort, but we need over 100 billion to do the numbers that they're talking about in terms of social homes. If you want to stop the growth of the PRS, there's 2 ways to do it. One, George Osborne's way, since 2015, which has been carried on. The hostile environment for landlords, I'll call it. You know what that's been if you're anywhere near the industry. And that seems to be continuing, probably with the same level of aggression. The Renters' Rights Bill, as I said, would have been far better for the landlords if passed under the Conservatives, but instead everybody wanted to mess around instead, and now they've let Labour do it, and that won't be ideal. But then what we've also got to consider on the other side of that, instead of the hostile environment, is you lessen the need for the PRS if you build social homes. One way of looking at the problem, which is quite a good way of framing it, I think, is the problems are caused by people who can't afford to be in the PRS, but they're in the PRS anyway. Right now, again, I'm expecting this system to fall apart over the next 5 years after renters' rights, because things need to get so much stricter, because they're being legislated so much harder. But where do those people then get housed? Well, I'll tell you where they get housed. They get housed in the temporary accommodation sector at a great cost to councils, a higher cost to councils, and it causes a problem. So an extra 2 billion, I'm all in favour. I think we need to put way more money into social housing. I think we could justify outside of the fiscal rules if we said, look, we're going to invest, we're going to create these assets. Not only that, but these assets, so therefore this social home is going to give this nurse or whoever, whichever family on a low enough income to qualify for social housing, or to be a key worker who qualifies for social housing, it's going to give them enough income. They're going to be off universal credit. They're going to be all the rest of it. They're nearer to work. They're in a cheaper accommodation because their rents are lower, because their rent is lower. They can spend more. That's good for the economy, etc., etc., etc. And of course, if the government does build social housing, although at the start it's 250 grand a house or whatever it's going to cost them, depending on where they are in the country, that might be a big net loss. But in 20 years' time, 40 years' time, if you amortize these things over, let's say, 100-year lifespan of a building, and let's face it, that would be, we've got plenty of buildings that are still standing from 100 years ago and 150 years ago, then in that case, we're investing in assets that are going to go up in value, even if they only go up by inflation. Property has only gone up by the retail price index in about the last 22 years now in the UK. It's about equal with RPI. And yeah, there's been some ups and downs because we had the crash, we had the COVID boom, we had a little haircut afterwards, a little wobble after old Liz the lettuce and all the rest of it. That's where we are. So I think there's a good argument for ploughing a load more money into social housing, to be honest with you. But let's see what happens. So they then drill down in the report into economic and fiscal outlook. So as I've said, this housing is bringing them positive GDP in the forecast, which gives them more money to spend, invest, waste, depending on your outlook on what the government does with the money. But also lowering the amount of borrowing that needs to be done. So this was a better result than I expected in overall, this higher growth over the whole of the forecast period. I do ask myself whether there's a bit of gaming the system going on and someone influences the OBR to say, look, you'll have to take a bit off this year, but can you put loads more on over the next 4? I don't know. Their forecasts haven't been great. They're pretty bullish on growth overall. But if we're going to deregulate, let me tell you, there's definitely achievable some of these growth numbers. So let's see this talk about deregulation actually turn into deregulation. Let's see what happens, right? Now, the OBR's view of inflation is in here as well, 3.8% peak in July. That's where they sit. So they're close enough. They're sort of 3 months out from where Southampton think that they're going to be. they're going to be, from where the Bank of England think they're going to be. That's about right. So that's, as I say, I can't. 3.5% to 4% feels like about the top for this cycle for this year. So I don't really disagree with those. Timing wise, like I say April as the most problematic, but I don't do month by month modelling analysis of the inflation rate as it goes. I tend to adjust my forecasts quite close to the time, simply on the basis of what I see going on. And there's usually a factor or two that people have missed out. Exchange rates have changed. This has happened. That's happened, etc., etc. Bond yields are higher. That's problematic because that just means we're paying more for our debt. We issue more debt. At the moment, it's the same as it is in the mortgage market. The average mortgage is going out the door, according to the Bank of England, at about 4.5%. And then the outstanding stock of debt is more like at about 3.6% or so. So we're paying less than we do on a new loan. There's still a net negative when someone's mortgage expires. It'll be a big day when those two cross back over and rates are really on the way back down. Although, as we know, and as I've been saying for a long time, rates are not massively on the way down. They're just nibbling down ever so slowly, but they're basically where they've been for about the last 14 months at the moment, with a little bit of up and down, but there's always some volatility, right? They moan about volatile oil prices, obviously not unusual. And then global market volatility has risen. The VIX, as it's called, the fear factor in the US market, has been well above its 20 handle for over a month now, and you've seen quite big chunks come off the S&P, but you've seen this crazy sort of journey where Trump got elected, big emotional wave, Tesla stock goes up 100%, then reality bites and Tesla aren't selling cars anymore, and Elon's gone a bit bats, and they drop by 50%, which basically puts them back to where they started before all that speculation was happening. So I heard a great phrase around the time of the US election: buy the election, sell the inauguration, when Trump got elected, which basically meant everyone thinks he's going to do loads of great pro-business stuff, but in reality he's not. And that at the moment is exactly what's happened, because like I said, investment capital doesn't care. It doesn't get political, right? It goes, not sure about these tariffs. No one's sure about them because really they're just being used as a negotiating tool. Therefore, I'd rather kind of stay away from all of those industries that have got any tariff threats hanging over their heads. And that's what we're seeing happening at the moment. So growth has slowed in trading partners. Yeah, we're not actually doing too badly compared to the G7. The OECD has us as the second fastest growing G7 economy this year and next year, top being the US, of course. So now that's sometimes positioned as a competitive thing. We're doing better than France, we're doing better than Germany, blah, blah, blah. It's not really about that. If your trading partners aren't growing, then what you export to them can't grow realistically, or it's harder for that to grow. That's why it's monitored in the real world, right? So they also moan about the long-standing structural challenges of the UK economy. People out of work due to ill health, I've said earlier on, but of course, if there's an incentive to do that because your benefits are higher, there has to be a percentage of claims that are being stretched to ill health when they're not necessarily, and that needs to be disincentivized. And that's what the cuts to benefits are doing, ultimately, bloodless as that might sound. And then growth policies, this parliament, we're talking about output in 10 years' time now. They are claiming to have added 0.5%, 0.6% to the GDP of the economy. The forecasts always look great because everything's just going up nice and smoothly in the forecasts, and then the real world comes along, and it really doesn't work like that, as I'm sure everybody knows. Stability-wise, well, they're now changing that to a commentary around defence. As I said, the UK is still extremely extractive because of the rule of law, because of private property rights, because of all that sort of stuff. They're doing a good job at the moment to keep the foaming far left of the party away from compromising things like private property rights, although they will have a little bit of a go at them. And I'm actually in support of compromising them in long-term empty homes, for example. I think they need a much better solution, because we can't be sitting with 1.2 million empty homes in England. We need a quarter of that. We need about 300,000 for turnover in the PRS. And presumably social sector works similarly. And it's of a similar sort of size. So maybe another 250,000 need to be there in the social sector. because people do move, because refurbs do need to happen because of all of those reasons. I know it sounds like a lot, but then that's the same argument as we need about 3% of people to be unemployed because they're moving around the country. It's just frictional and structural, right? It happens, and people need to be in retraining and all the rest of it. And they're moving between jobs. Things happen. Companies need to be able to go broke. They need to be able to start up. That leads to that sort of friction. So about nearly half of those empty homes can probably be justified reasonably, but the other half really can't. And it's the long-term empties that really need addressing, not just an empty home. That's just silly, of course, but maybe redefine what a long-term empty looks like, or have a plan after 6 months, after 12 months, after 18 months, after 24 months compulsory purchase. I don't think I'd have too big an issue with that, to be honest with you. It's always the thin end of the wedge that causes a problem or a bit of nervousness in these situations. And then talk a bit about investment, increasing capital investment by over 100 billion during the forecast period. And that will, if sustained, put GDP up by 0.4% after 10 years and by 1.4% in the long run. So the long run's more than 10 years. So look forward to that, folks. I don't put too much stock into all of that, to be honest with you. But yeah, a big box in the summary about planning reform and this impact is going to have on the economy, extra 7 billion quid. Pretty impressive. I think it could actually be better and more. I think it probably understates the impact of the right level of housing for the right person. So let's just boil it down to the figures, like that I like to. Right, the average social home has got a household income of 25 grand. Yeah, the average PRS home has got an income of about 34 grand. This was from the last time the Bank of England released these numbers, right? And the average owner-occupier with mortgage home has got a household income of 59 grand. Yeah, so you see huge differences amongst those, but you also see that there's not a massive difference between social and private, but it is massive because 9 on 25 is more than 33% more income just to be in the PRS. And then you've nearly got to double your income to be able to afford to be an owner-occupier. And there's a bit of brutal reality in there somewhere. But if you're too far away from those, if you're below, 20% below the average there, let's say, it's going to be a bit of a stretch for you. So that would only be, people in the high 20s. So it's single person on minimum wage, kind of difficult, even full time. If they're in an HMO, you can understand it, but you can see where affordability will be compromised. If they're in a 1-bed flat, let alone a 2-bed flat, it's going to be difficult for them. They're not going to have a lot of money to live on, and they need appropriate housing in these situations. Makes a huge difference in other countries in Europe, apart from something they do better than us. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the growth forecasts that have now been amended by the OBR. So growth accelerating to 1.9 in 2026. Sounds hopeful, but, with the wind behind us, if this stability is really there, I think still a fair bit's going to depend on what Mr. Trump is doing, whether he will have calmed down by then or whether he will have ramped things up if he isn't going his own way. You'd expect it to be the latter rather than the former if he isn't. How much trouble we're in, we'll see, because he's picking on everybody, isn't he, really? And this is one of the first benefits I've really seen of Brexit, in that we're not Europe as far as he's concerned, and his understanding of Europe and the United States of Europe, as I think the guys in his top team see it. And then they're looking at we're looking at 9.4% compound growth by the end of the forecast, which is Q1 2030, and that was 9.2 in the October forecast. Now, the October forecast did not really take the budget into account. I thought it was a pretty poor piece of work, to be honest. It did bake in what was going to happen, but it didn't bake it in with 2020. It thought we would, and this is where the OBR really should answer for themselves, really, because how could they see that increase in employers' national insurance and say we're still going to grow 2% next year? They just didn't do the numbers correctly. It was never going to happen. It was very, very obvious what was going to happen to growth. At that point, it was going to absolutely flatline, and that's exactly what it's done. So I've already mentioned they've said their inflation peak at 3.8 in July. And then also, this is where Rachel made one of her mistakes here yesterday, because what she did was she started talking about real household disposable income, which is one of my favourite metrics I've talked about many times before. So why? Well, real, adjusted for inflation. Household, it's households that pay rent, not people, right? Disposable, tax, HMRC's had their cut, yeah. and then income, so what people have got left to spend. Now you've got RHDI, and then you've got RHDI per capita, so per head real income, and that's actually going to be rising over this course of the Parliament to the tune of 500 quid by the end of the forecast period. Now it sounds like nothing, right? But that's real, and nobody made that distinction in the news that I heard about. That's after inflation that has been forecasted at a reasonable rate. I still think the forecast in 3, 4, 5 years' time is too low. I still think we've got significantly persistent inflation to deal with here. Let's see. But nonetheless, that was forecast to be falling, and that has fallen. That has fallen since 2022. RHDI per cap, right? Real household disposable income has gone up, but we've got more people per household is one of the reasons for that. So it is important for people to be, I'm not sure 500 quid will give people a real feel-good factor. Again, probably better expressed as a percentage rather than anything else. I guess they're damned if they could, and they're damned if they did, and they're damned if they didn't. But the fact that it's rising instead of it was forecast to be falling before, that was really the point that should have been drawn out. So it wasn't made very well, unfortunately, by the comms teams or by Rachel herself. It's just one of those things. She's got these figures in her head. She understands this stuff. She thinks she's talking to people who understand it, but when it goes out to the general public, they don't understand it, and then they're not interested in it. Really, they're not seeing it. So there we are. So yeah, this hopeful 1.9% growth in 26, 1.8 in 27, 1.7 in 28, and 1.8 in 29. It is hopeful, folks. Like I said, deregulation is possible. Deregulation that bites could easily see that go above 2%. We're definitely capable of 2% plus. We've got to see this deregulation and see if it works or if they lose their bottle on some of it. To be honest with you, that's what it'll come down to. So they're baking in a fair bit of increasing household consumption, that has pretty much cratered since the pandemic, but it is on the way back up. We've probably seen the end of it, seen the worst of it. They're also looking at pretty good levels of business investment. I'm not sure what we're going to see on business investment. They forecast minus 0.2% for 2025. I think it's probably worse than that. They're also having to forecast government investment going down at the end of the period, because they've always got these cuts at the end of the period. But the end of the period never comes, because you get the next period, and then you've got a new period from the future with which to cut, in theory, when you get there, and you never get there. It's just a bit of the way the game is played on these forecasts, I'm afraid. And then private dwellings investment, they see an 8.8% increase in 27 and another 8.8% increase in 28. And it's possible, right? Because that is the timing for the planning system, and that is the timing for construction. If it can be done, it could be party time. If the government's putting that extra money in, let's see it. Let's hope for it, right? They also see employment continuing to go up and up. So they see 400,000 more people in employment by the end of 2025 than 2024. I'm skeptical on that, because I think GDP might be okay, but I think that some workers are going to suffer. It's more expensive to employ people. I don't really believe we're going to see that, if I'm honest with you. They see unemployment of 4.5. At the end of this year, I'm more at 4.8. Let's see. They also now see productivity going up at a level that it hasn't gone up over a number of years. Now, if I'm right, productivity will go up because fewer people will be employed, so the cost of delivery will be lower. Let's see. But they've got some really ambitious figures in there for real household disposable income growth as well. No real negatives in their forecast, apart from the cuts of 2028, 29, and 29, 30, which I don't believe that we'll ever see, to be honest with you. I'm going to wrap in about 5 minutes, folks, if you are hanging on. So I'm just going to try and get through the rest of what I can. So that's sort of where the OBR are. Where are we going to be at in terms of debt terms and things like that? Public sector is being seen to be kept roughly the same in terms of its net worth, if you like. The debt, they're trying not to move it up too much. But budget deficit wise, they're saying it will start rowing backwards in 27, 28. I remain skeptical about that. That's what the forecast always says. So let's see how we go. And then changes in borrowing coming down fairly significantly, but more borrowing in this forecast than the last one, primarily because, apart from anything else, higher inflation, other than anything else. So direct effective policy decisions, bringing it down a reasonable amount as well. That's some of the things that we were talking about in terms of the housing stock side of things, right? So do we believe this forecast is really going to make any difference on, or is particularly accurate? I mean, some people just give up, don't they? And they say, well, these forecasts are never accurate anyway, so we don't need to worry about the forecast. As soon as it comes out, it's wrong. But are we likely to get 5 years of smoothness now coming out after a ropier year this year? I just don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. So I'll just stream through for the last bit, a bit about what's being said on defence aside from anything else. They talk a bit more in a breakdown of what exactly they're going to do on defence. UK defence innovation. This is talking about research and development. A ring-fence budget of 400 million quid. That's going to be a quick startup. That's starting from next month. So my hope, as I say, pretty simply, is that we buy British in that department, because that's what we need to do in order to make it remotely successful. The peace dividend, as it's been known for some years, is over. The USA that fights the commies, or whatever you want to call it, the Cold War USA is over. I think we just need to face that. We need to see if that maybe starts to repair itself after there's a 2028 US presidential election. But as I say, will that be a change of party? Will that be an even more aggressive approach to that than Trump? This is what the people want to hear in the US at the moment. We're not spending money abroad, even though all that money they theoretically sent to Ukraine, 80% of it was spent in the US anyway. And they're now looking for a big return on that money, as you know, with the negotiations they are undertaking on Ukraine's behalf, or without Ukraine's consent, depending on how you look at it, with Vladimir Putin. So quite interesting. Now there's always some talk about closing the tax gap, so unpaid tax in general. There are some pretty significant changes that have been made. Dan Needle has released a piece of work about this. If you don't know Dan's work, he was the guy who brought down Nadeem Zahawi, apart from anything else, the Conservative minister who wasn't paying his tax. And we're all in favour of everyone paying their tax, of course. So I'd recommend you take a look at Dan's work on that side of things if you want. Some fairly radical shifts, he says, in terms of what professional services need to do for tax avoiders. Unpaid debt, 44 billion at the end of last year, which is more than double what it was at the end of 2019. Now, we know we've got more digital stuff going on. We know that the government are going to invest big in AI, and we know that HMRC are going to take advantage of a lot of this stuff. So I actually think they could, and this is something that repeats itself every time a government speaks, is we'll collect more of this tax and all the rest of it. We'll prosecute more fraudsters. But I think the Labour Party are pretty serious about this. And I think they are going to be able to make some headway. And I think it'd be relatively easy with someone like Dan on board, who I know is very influential in the Labour Party, and is probably doing his ideal work on that front, because he can stay apolitical, but also be significantly close to the government and tell them what they need to be doing in this department. And he described himself yesterday as delighted when he'd seen it. So must be pretty strong efforts. So it'd be interesting to start cracking down on fraud, apart from anything else, I'd have thought, and investment scams and stuff like that, because they could probably make at least as much money if they were able to stop those early on. Let's face it. Whether they will, how they go about that, half of all crime is fraud now. I'm informed from seeing the figures. So there we go. And the public sector reform, I'll probably close on this, because can this work? There was a 7.6 million backlog in the health service, 300,000 people waiting more than a year for treatment. Asylum backlogs were costing 6.4 billion with a backlog. Those backlogs are coming down. The waiting lists are coming down. The number of asylum cases are going down. The number of appeals are going up because they're processing more cases. That's kind of relatively obvious, using a little bit. But also the total number of asylum-related returns in 2024 increased by 36%. So that's pretty impressive. Like they're actually doing something about that, even though, again, it maybe doesn't feel particularly Labour. But that's what's going on. So you have to be in support of that sort of stuff, I think, really, to be honest with you. The Transformation Fund, 3.25 billion for public services, for AI in public services, worth doing, again, obviously. And then there's some relatively, it surprises you that £8 million can make it into the statement, really, to be honest, supporting the management of offenders in the community. 8 million for new tech for probation officers. But hopefully some of this new tech will actually start to work and there won't be workarounds for it, really. But their goal is to cut regulatory costs to businesses by 25%. That will be an incredible value adder. And you might have heard as well, in the last week, this number's been released, 15% off administrative budgets. Look, I don't want to pour cold water on any of this. I'm absolutely in support of an awful lot of this stuff. Will it happen? It almost never does. They almost always forecast what they can get away with. It looks good in the figures. As I say, the bond markets believe it, keeps things relatively calm. Like I say, I want to be an optimist, right? Let's hope so. It does look like we've had the rocky part, and it does look like, look, ultimately, there was a lot of less informed people yesterday who believed that taxes were going to go up again. They didn't. They'll now be sweating October because a lot of the semi-intelligent chat out there is saying, well, we don't know what could happen between now and October. And of course, quite a lot could happen. Bad tariff outcomes for the UK, right? Stuff might need to be done on the back of that. But Rachel Reeves has painted, she's staying in the box she's painted herself into here, which is no increases in VAT, national insurance, corporation tax, etc. And after October, should that happen, I think people will really start to believe it, and that will make a difference to business investment. We've got a rocky few months to get through. We've got to see what the US are doing and all the rest of it. Just before I go, I'm going to answer one question that I've had via the YouTube channel. So thank you to Scott for submitting it. He says, with regards to the average incomes for social, PRS and owner-occupiers, are these mode, mean or median? As we both know. So I'll just rattle through that just in case you don't remember your maths from school. So mode is the most popular. So the biggest number. So it wouldn't be mode, Scott, because you would be looking at, by the pound in that case. They don't tend to use modes as a rule. Modes are a particularly specific purpose. They do prefer to use the median, but in this situation, the mean and the median won't be a million miles away. So the mean is just the arithmetic average, right? You add them all up and divide. There'll obviously be a lot of pensioners, for example, in rental accommodation, all the way through to there'll be people in the City of London who earn 250 grand a year, but they're in a rental flat. Because they don't want to buy one down there. The stamp duty is ridiculous. They might only be in the city for 2, 3, 4 years, and it doesn't make sense to invest all that money and go through the hassle of buying a place when you could stick with a rental. So my understanding from the Bank of England figures was that they were means rather than medians. Like you suggest, Scott, I would rather use medians in that example, but I don't think that mean and median would be drastically different. Good question, though. Thanks for submitting it. Hope everyone on Property and Poppadoms and on Propenomix on the YouTube channel live have enjoyed this live. I kind of hope there are more reasons to do more of these, but I like it when there aren't reasons to do them as well, to be honest. But I hope that's somewhat helpful with a bit of a state of the union and where we're looking at after the spring statement, apart from anything else. So thanks for tuning in, everyone, and have a good rest of the week. I'll be back Sunday.